At its peak in 1920, one empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and governed over 450 million people, almost 1 in 4 humans on Earth. The sun, they said, never set on the British Empire. But empires built on ambition, violence, and exploitation don't last forever. This is the story of how a small, rainy island off the coast of Europe came to dominate the world, and why it all came crashing down. England in the 1500s was nobody special. While Spain and Portugal were getting rich off the New World, England was just another European kingdom, struggling with internal problems and bad weather. But the English had something that would change everything. Ambition mixed with absolute ruthlessness. It started with pirates. Francis Drake and men like him weren't just criminals. They were state-sponsored raiders attacking Spanish treasure ships. The gold and silver they stole didn't just make them rich. It financed England's transformation into a maritime power. Queen Elizabeth knighted Drake. Let that sink in. A pirate became a national hero because he brought home stolen wealth. Then, in 1600, a group of London merchants did something that would reshape the world. They formed the East India Company and got a royal charter to trade with Asia. This wasn't just a business. It was a weapon of conquest disguised as commerce. Nobody realized it yet, but this company would eventually control more territory and people than most empires in history. The formula was brilliant in its cruelty. Send ships to distant lands, set up trading posts, make friends with local rulers, play them against their rivals, loan them money, offer military support, and slowly, gradually, turn economic influence into political control. What started as buying spices ended with ruling entire continents. But trade alone doesn't build empires. You need warships, lots of them. By the 1700s, the Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force ever created. British warships were everywhere, protecting merchant vessels, intimidating rivals, and projecting power across every ocean. Control the seas, and you control global trade. Control global trade, and you control the world. The British understood this better than anyone. Now let's talk about India, because this is where you really see how the machine worked. The Mughal Empire was falling apart. Local princes were fighting each other, and the East India Company walked right into the chaos. They didn't arrive with armies saying, "We're here to conquer you." They came as traders, then mediators, then allies. Subtle, patient, deadly. In 1757, everything changed at a place called Plassey. Robert Clive had 3,000 men facing a Bengali army of 50,000. He should have been destroyed. Instead, he bribed the enemy commanders, and they threw the battle. Clive won through conspiracy, not courage. And just like that, the company controlled Bengal, one of the richest regions on Earth. Here's where it gets diabolical. The company used Indian soldiers, called sepoys, to conquer the rest of India. They turned Indians into the instruments of their own subjugation, paying them a fraction of what British soldiers earned and sending them to fight their neighbors. By the mid-1800s, a private corporation controlled the entire subcontinent. They didn't just govern India, they looted it systematically. They taxed farmers until famines became regular occurrences. They destroyed local industries, particularly textiles, forcing Indians to buy British-manufactured goods instead. India went from producing a quarter of the world's industrial output to becoming impoverished. The wealth flowed one direction, toward Britain. When the sepoys finally rebelled in 1857, the British response was genocidal. Villages were burned, rebels were tied to cannons and blown apart, thousands were hanged. The message was clear: resist and we'll destroy everything. After crushing the rebellion, the British Crown took direct control. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. While this was happening in Asia, Britain was deeply involved in humanity's greatest crime, the transatlantic slave trade. British ships transported over 3 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. Liverpool, Bristol, London. These cities built their wealth on human cargo. The triangle trade manufactured goods to Africa, slaves to the Americas, sugar and cotton back to Britain, generated obscene profits. When Britain finally abolished slavery in 1833, don't mistake this for pure morality. The Industrial Revolution had made slavery less economically necessary, and Britain had other ways to exploit the world. In fact, the British government compensated slave owners for their lost property. Think about that. They paid the slavers, not the enslaved. Then came the scramble for Africa. And this was imperialism at its most naked and cynical. In 1884, European powers met in Berlin and literally divided Africa on a map. They drew borders with rulers, splitting ethnic groups, forcing rival tribes into the same territories, creating nations that had never existed. And the Africans had no voice in this at all. Britain grabbed Egypt to control the Suez Canal, the shortcut to India. They took South Africa for its diamonds and gold, fighting brutal wars against both the indigenous peoples and the Dutch settlers. They colonized Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and more. The method was always the same. Find something valuable, claim the territory, install compliant local leaders, extract the resources, and crush resistance. In East Africa, the British built railways, but not to help Africans travel. These railways connected mines and plantations to ports. Everything was designed for extraction. Raw materials went to Britain. Manufactured goods came back to the colonies at markup prices. The colonies existed to enrich the mother country, period. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were different because the British didn't just want to exploit these places. They wanted to replace the people living there. They declared these lands practically empty, terra nullius, ignoring the indigenous peoples who'd lived there for thousands of years. British settlers poured in, recreating British society while pushing native populations to the margins. In Australia, Aboriginal children were forcibly taken from their families to be raised in white society, a practice that continued into the 1970s. In Canada, First Nations children were put in residential schools designed to erase their culture. The goal was cultural genocide, making indigenous people disappear by erasing their identity. The Caribbean colonies were sugar factories powered by slavery. Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad. These islands ran on the blood of enslaved Africans who died in horrific numbers. The mortality rate was so high that plantation owners constantly needed fresh slaves from Africa. It was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to keep them alive. After abolition, they just renamed slavery, bringing indentured servants from India and China under contracts that trapped them in debt bondage. By 1920, the British Empire covered almost a quarter of Earth's land surface. It was the largest empire in human history. The sun never set on British territory because they had possessions in every time zone. From Canada to India, from Egypt to Australia, from the Caribbean to Hong Kong, the Union Jack flew everywhere. But how do you actually control hundreds of millions of people when you only have tens of thousands of British administrators? The British perfected several techniques. Divide and rule was fundamental. In India, they favored certain religious and ethnic groups over others, creating resentments that led to horrific violence during partition and still cause problems today. In the Middle East and Africa, they deliberately drew borders to prevent unified opposition. They also created collaborating elites, local rulers and educated classes who benefited from cooperation with the empire. These people did the daily work of governance, while the British maintained ultimate control. It was cheaper and more effective than direct rule, and everything was justified by racism dressed up as moral duty. The British convinced themselves they were bringing civilization to backward peoples, that empire was a burden they nobly bore for the benefit of the colonized. This wasn't just propaganda. Many British people genuinely believed it, which made them even more dangerous. But empires contain the seeds of their own destruction. World War I weakened Britain economically and militarily. Millions of colonial subjects fought for the empire, and they came home asking why they weren't free. Nationalist movements grew stronger. Gandhi's non-violent resistance in India captured global imagination. Pan-African movements demanded independence. The colonized were done being subjects. World War II delivered the final blow. Britain survived but emerged broke, dependent on American loans, unable to maintain a global empire. The new superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, opposed old-style colonialism, though they had their own imperial ambitions. Britain had no choice but to begin retreating. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, but the rushed partition led to one of history's great catastrophes. Over 1 million people died in religious violence as Muslims and Hindus fled in opposite directions across new borders. Families were destroyed, cities burned, women were raped and murdered. Britain's parting gift was chaos. After India, the dam broke. Burma, Ceylon, Palestine, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya. The empire dissolved territory by territory through the 50s and 60s. Some transitions were relatively peaceful. Others involved brutal counter-insurgency campaigns. In Kenya, the British fought the Mau Mau uprising with concentration camps and torture. In Malaysia, they waged a long jungle war against communist insurgents. By 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China, the empire was essentially gone. All that remained were tiny islands scattered across the oceans, remnants of what had been. The legacy is everywhere and complicated. English became a global language. Parliamentary democracy and common law spread worldwide. But so did artificial borders that still cause wars. Economies designed for extraction that still keep countries poor, and the psychological damage of racial subjugation that still shapes societies. Economists estimate Britain extracted $45 trillion from India alone. Africa's resources built British industry, while African development was deliberately suppressed. The wealth from empire helped make Britain prosperous, While former colonies still struggle with structures imposed during colonial rule, the British Empire rose through naval power, economic exploitation, and ruthless pragmatism. It justified itself with racist ideology while extracting unimaginable wealth. It fell because all empires fall, because the oppressed eventually resist, because the costs exceeded the benefits, because the foundations were rotten. 3.5 centuries of global dominance ended not with conquest, but with exhaustion. The question isn't why the empire fell. It's how it lasted so long, and whether we've learned anything from its crimes. If you enjoy this video and want more, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.